Hello, Deborah Ishihara here, podcast editor for Talking Work. This week I'm taking a look at equality in terms of transgender rights and Me Too in India. Welcome to Talking Work, the employment law podcast by Jus Laboris. In each episode, we invite a different guest to discuss what's happening in the world of work. If you're an HR professional of any kind, this podcast is for you. I'm delighted to have with me today Debjani Aich, who's a partner at Kochhar Co, our Indian firm, to talk about these issues. Hello, Debjani.
Hi, Deborah.
Now, there was a case a few years ago in which the Supreme Court of India made a declaration about transgender rights, and that's now transforming the landscape. Debjani, could you tell me something about that case, first of all?
So, interestingly, Indian law has always been binary in nature, recognizing the male and female genders. And so, 2014 was a landmark judgment. It was a case called the National Legal Services Authority and the Union of India, also called the NALSA judgment, in which the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in India, declared transgender people as the third gender. So this was legal recognition given to the third gender for the first time as per case law and judicial precedent. The petition had been brought about by NALSA, which is a not for profit organization looking at providing free legal aid services to disadvantaged sections of Indian society. There were a couple of other petitioners in it as well, another NGO, and a Hijra activist, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi. I'll speak about hijras and these very unique Indian terminologies a little bit later. It's something that I do want to touch upon. So, anybody who's been to India knows that Indian history, Indian societal levels are very complex. And interestingly enough, and this is very important, for background awareness, Indian history has recognized the third gender from time immemorial across religions. It's not easy in a diverse culture like ours. One could say that with the advent of colonialism and super sensitivity or heightened sensitivity, there was a narrowing down of a lot of free thinking across the country, resulting in several archaic laws and practices. The NALSA judgment is truly one of the most important steps towards gender equality in India, wherein Indian citizens now have the right to self identification of their gender as male, female, or third gender. Very importantly, all fundamental rights guaranteed to an Indian citizen under the Constitution of India are now equally applicable to transgenders. The Supreme Court laid down some brilliant, in my opinion, and path breaking guidance, which included requiring reservations to transgenders in admissions in educational institutions, public sector jobs, directing the so the federal government in India is called the central government, and state governments to take proper measures to provide medical aid, medical care to transgenders, very importantly for dignity and respect, separate public toilets and other facilities. And something I think which is in line with a lot of global practices was the Supreme Court said that it is preferable to follow the psyche of a person and use a psychological test as opposed to a biological test to determine gender, declaring that insisting on sex reassignment surgery or sex reaffirming surgery, which is a better term to use in my opinion, as a condition for changing one's gender is illegal.
Okay. And how has the judgment impacted the law in India since it was handed down?
So India, we have a long history of creating a lot of draft laws that go through various permutations before they're actually codified into law. Partially in response to the NALSA judgment in 2019, the Indian Parliament enacted what is called the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. This act has had its fair share of criticism from cis and trans individuals. The rules are still not in place, but it's still all said and done, this is the first codified law in India that defines a transgender and also provides various legal protections to them.
And who exactly is covered by the Act?
Transgender in the Act includes all individuals whose gender does not conform to the gender assigned to them at birth. And this includes trans men and trans women, whether or not they've undergone sex reassignment surgery. I know I'm using sex reassignment surgery. That's what the law says. I would ideally like to have used sex reaffirmation surgery, but I'm sticking with sex reassignment because that's what the law says. And the law also includes individuals with socio-cultural identities like Kinnar, Hijra, which I mentioned earlier, Aravani, and Jogta.
Mm-hmm.
These terms, Kinnar, Hijra, Aravni, and Jokta, they are used often interchangeably. It's very important to know that you shouldn't use these terms in a derogatory manner. Putting it across very simply, and there are a lot of social layers here. Hijra, Kinnar, and Aravani have the same meaning, which can be loosely translated in English as a eunuch. Hijra and Kinnar are terms used in northern India and western India, with Aravani more commonly seen in southern India, specifically Tamil Nadu. Jogta or Jogti, as the case may be, are terms used in Maharashtra and Karnataka, again loosely including male and female servants who dedicate their lives to gods in different temples. Other sections that you see mentioned in the Nalsa judgment are Kothis, which are a heterogeneous group of biological males who show varying degrees of being effeminate. They may not necessarily identify as being transgender or being a hijra. It's a very complex, very subtle arrangement of layers of society, actually layers of individuals, and one really truly needs to spend a lot of time in understanding about the nuances, about the deep rooted history
Hmm.
of transgenders in India to actually appreciate how this
Hmm.
works.
That's really fascinating stuff. Um, Getting back to the Act, who's required to implement the Act?
Okay, so the Act talks about stakeholders, identified stakeholders, which include the central government, the state governments, and establishments under Indian company law, which include private sector companies, associations, cooperative societies, trusts,
Hmm.
etc.
Which brings us to employers. So, what are employers required to do under the Act?
It's something extremely simple. I'll start with a very simple premise of ensuring respect and equal opportunity at the workplace across board. Employers, both in the government and the private sector, need to make sure not to discriminate against trans individuals. They can't deny or discontinue access to employment or treat them unfairly. When I talk about discontinuing, I'm talking about termination aspects. They need to recognize trans identity. There's a specific chapter in the Act, Chapter 5, that talk about rules relating to recruitment and promotion, for example. Employers also need to have an adequate grievance redressal mechanism to deal with complaints relating to violations of the Act.
And are there penalties for failure to comply with the Act?
There are penalties. The penalties have received some amount of criticism from the trans community as not being stringent enough. Right now, the penalties that exist, including some that impact labor, for example, if anybody compels or entices a transgender individual into forced or bonded labor, or commits an act or intends to do an act causing physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, or economic harm or abuse against a transgender individual, they may be punishable with imprisonment of between 6 months to 2 years or a fine. The fine hasn't been specified yet.
And do you expect all this to have a big impact on the way transgender people are actually treated in the workplace?
For a country like India, where there have been transgenders since literally, I mean, since time immemorial, we're still looking at a bit of a long haul path to ensure genuine inclusivity and diversity at the Indian work structure. The Act comes with its own flaws, major ones being the requirement of a transgender person to obtain a government certificate and a transgender person certificate, which will give a trans person the right to change the name on their birth certificate and all other documents updated accordingly. So, while you can get this certificate based on self identification, in case of sex reassignment surgery, a revised certificate will need to be obtained, which is contrary to gender identification as generally accepted in many parts of the world. The Act is thus I would say, a preliminary step to at least ensuring basic inclusion at the Indian workplace. The extent to which the stakeholders will take positive steps to facilitate inclusion is uncertain. There are some penalties, but the Act is largely silent on the consequences of non compliance by stakeholders. So what I feel, and I think this is something that's echoed by a lot of people, a lot of allies working in the LGBTQIA space, is that preparing the Indian workspace for an inclusive approach towards transgender individuals is going to be a bit of an uphill task, as accommodating societal changes of this magnitude has been notoriously slow in India. Improving the status of the transgender community will really have to be a collective effort. Educating oneself about this section of society is a really big step in the right direction.
So, what do you suggest employers should do to ensure the culture of their organisations is fair for trans people?
I say this a lot whenever I do trainings and workshops for my clients and otherwise. And this is something I reiterate all the time. I said it right at the beginning. It's a really simple premise: ensure respect at the workplace. From a legal compliance perspective, employers will need to educate and sensitize their workforces around gender inclusivity,
Mm.
assimilation at the workplace, and greater acceptance of the character of transgender individuals. Deborah, from a societal perspective, how things have progressed over the years is that even men and women, if you're looking at cis men and cis women, even there's a bit of a divide at the workplace even now amongst them. We don't do very well with intergender conversations, and then making sure that there's complete acceptance of a transgender human, a transgender person, is even more nuanced as such.
Mm.
So employers need to review policies from an IND perspective. It's highly recommended to get suggestions from
Mm.
transgender individuals and NGOs who work in this space so they reflect real life views. Just a couple of weeks back, a few weeks ago, there was a glorious piece of advocacy from the Chennai High Court, where the judge in that particular case, which related to two bisexual individuals, actually underwent psychological training on LGBTQI matters, including detailed discussions with a transgender woman. She happened to be a doctor, by the way, and her mother, to better educate himself on aspects relating to their lives and requirements. I loved that. I mean, the fact that a sitting judge is
Mm.
educating himself because he needed inputs was great. And that's something employers can also work with.
Mm.
Now, in terms of people going through gender
Yeah.
reaffirmation surgery, gender reassignment surgery, an employer can consider having a policy to provide transition support, not only in terms of paid leave, but also sensitizing the remaining cis workforce regarding the transition and providing the individuals with rehab support and counseling. India has a very strong prevention of sexual harassment law, prevention of sexual harassment at workplace law. It's something I work with. It was similar to the requirements under, it's called the POSH Act, similar to the requirements under the POSH Act. Organizations may consider having or will actually need to have an adequate grievance redressal mechanism for transgender individuals to deal with harassment complaints. Employees must have access to washrooms that are appropriate for their identity. That is something I think across the world, it's universal that trans men and women are often subjected to humiliation and harassment as they're forced to use misgendered washrooms. I don't think anybody
Mm.
would be comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
Employers really need to keep in mind that transgender individuals have been subject to years of discrimination, which has led to severe social, economic, and skill deficits. And accordingly, recruitment criteria really need to be revised if they can, as far as practical. Organizations should also endeavor to provide training programs to enhance skills.
Hmm. There's a lot of good tips there, Debjani. Um, I want to take a look now at the equality of women in the workplace, just to get your thoughts on this. India is a country that gets a lot of negative press internationally about women's rights. Can I ask you, politically, what's been the reaction in India over the past few years to the Me Too movement? Has it sparked the kind of reckoning that we've had in some parts of the West?
I am not going to give no political inputs here. I will tell you what I feel. As somebody who works, being an employment lawyer and somebody who's been working in equal employment rights for a very, very long time on, aspects of the prevention of sexual harassment is a key practice area that I do. The second wave of Me Too is seeing its fair share of press and social media movement across India. We have many women coming forward with complaints, and that actually is a great, great step in the right direction. There is a distinct awareness around sexual harassment at work issues, with most companies ensuring compliance with the law. I work a lot in this space. I have over a decade. It sounds makes me sound very old, but I have over a decade of working in this space. And from a personal perspective, I find many companies truly involved in ensuring that the workplace is a safe place for all genders, including women, way more than the law may require, which for me is so heartening to see.
So it does sound like employers are reacting to Me Too, even though the law isn't keeping up. Can you tell me more about what they've been doing?
Okay, like I mentioned, the prevention of sexual harassment at work is something most MNCs and smaller companies are aiming at eliminating and addressing as required under law. And in a lot of cases, going way beyond what the law requires because we're looking at genuine inclusion and diversity and making sure that the workplace is really free of harassment, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's gender-based harassment, anything like that. All of our clients have their internal committees in place. There are regular trainings for employees and managers, including from a remote working perspective. Okay, so one of the very few plus points that I see that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic was a shift to remote working, which, from a woman employee's perspective, has given them a little bit more of flexi hours. It's that comes with its own pitfalls because balancing home and work is really never easy, and I think all of us will agree on that. I've had
Mm.
instances where my daughter has walked in during a conference call, my dog has jumped behind me. I mean, and I think it's we've all been there, I think.
Yes, absolutely, we have.
Yeah, so employers are really working comprehensively on these aspects, including through policy change. Now,
Hmm.
when we look at things like pay parity and the gender pay gap in India, unfortunately, that continues to remain a significant issue. We have a really strong central law that relates to pay parity for men and women employees. But I was doing a little bit of research earlier last year, and I looked at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap. I think that was the 2020 index, wherein India ranks 112th on the overall global gender gap index out of 153 economies,
Mm.
which is, yeah, that's not pretty.
Yeah.
So only a quarter of women, compared to 82% of men in India, engage actively in the labor market. Given the fact that 48% of India's 1.4 billion population are women, those figures don't read right. I'm cautiously optimistic about the government taking a step in the right direction. Just for your awareness, at the beginning of in October 2020 and in August 2019, there was a huge set of labor law reforms in India, and what came about was something called the New Code of Wages, which has amalgamated the central laws relating to compensation aspects at work. Because of the pandemic and various other reasons, none of the codes have come into effect, including the Code of Wages.
Mm.
But the code is aimed at ensuring that there's no discrimination in an establishment amongst employees on the grounds of gender in matters relating to wages by the same employer when we're talking about the same work or work of a similar nature done by employee. And this, again, this is a fantastic move by the Indian government. The code has moved to using non binary gender as compared to the concept of only protecting women or the opposite sex under the current law. So, this is a progressive move to ensuring genuine EEO at the workplace. There are also protections in relation to job recruitment for the same or similar natured work and in employment conditions except where the employment of women in such work is prohibited or restricted under an existing law, like under the maternity benefit laws, where there are certain compliances where you cannot expect a pregnant woman to do some kind of arduous work or being on her feet for a very long time, things like that, or working, pre birth for a certain time period.
Hmm.
So, while I recognize there could have been a more nuanced approach, including aspects like sexual orientation within the scope of the code, I'm really happy with the direction the law is taking right now on pay parity in India.
Hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much, Debjani, for your fascinating insights. I should mention that there's an article on our website on the Indian third gender with a link to it in the notes to this podcast. We've also put Debjani's details in the notes so you can contact her directly, and mine are there too. You're always welcome to contact me on anything to do with employment law, and I'll answer your query, or if you need an expert in a particular country, say, I'll put you in touch with the right person. Meanwhile, do browse around our website. There's a massive information there on all sorts of employment related topics at usetheborus.com, and I hope you'll join us again next time. That's it for this episode of Talking Work, but we'll be back very soon with more insights from our guests from around the world. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. You can also visit usetheborus.com to access all our content, resources and tools.